Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the fourth International Conference on Positive Psychology by NPPA. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this keynote session. On behalf of the organizing team, I extend a warm greeting to our distinguished speaker, Mr. Andrew Soren. He's the founder and CEO of Eudaimonic by Design, a global network of facilitators, coaches, and advisors who share a passion for well-being and believe organizations must be designed to enable it. He's also the executive director of the International Positive Psychology Association, the leading global association dedicated to advancing the science of well being and its applications to promote human flourishing. For the past 25 years, Andrew has worked with some of the most recognized brands, nonprofits, and public sector teams to co create value based cultures, develop positive leadership, and design systems that empower people to be their best. He regularly writes and speaks about how to apply the science of well being at work. His most recent article, Meaningful Work, Well-Being and Health Enacting a Eudaimonic Vision, was published in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health. Since 2013, he has been a part of the instructional team at University of Pennsylvania's internationally renowned Master of Applied Positive Psychology program. Before becoming its executive director, he was a member of the board for IPPA and chaired the 2023 World Congress on Positive Psychology. He was a senior advisor in governance, culture, and leadership at LRN and spent 13 years at BMO Financial Group, one of Canada's largest banks. There, he led strategy in marketing and human resources, focusing on brand revitalization, leadership development, and the co creation of high performance culture. I also have the honor of introducing the chair for this session. Dr. Shilpa Bandyopadhyay is an assistant professor of psychology and the associate dean of capacity building at the Jindal Institute of Behavioral Sciences, OP Jindal Global University, India. She holds a PhD in psychology from Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi. She has published in reputed international peer-reviewed journals, including the Journal of Religion, Spirituality, and Aging, Frontiers in Psychology, International Journal of Well-Being, Journal of Cross-Cultural Gerontology, and the Journal of Aging and Environment, among others. Her research interests span geropsychology, positive psychology, and interpersonal relationships. Currently, she serves as an executive committee member of the National Positive Psychology Association. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Shabdapriti. Thank you so much. A very good morning to Mr. Andrew and a very good evening to all our participants. Thank you for joining us today. It is a real pleasure for me to chair this session today, especially because I offer a course on creating positive workplaces, and Mr. Andrew's session today, it really resonates with one question that we recurrently ask in the course, which is, how do we design workplaces that are not just good at business or profit, but also good for the people who are working over there? For students, graduates, and researchers in positive organizational behavior and scholarship, today's keynote session is a very great opportunity to engage with ideas that move beyond theory. And I also believe this session will resonate very well with the young people who are there in today's session who hope to build their own ventures moving forward. Because it is not every day that we get to hear from a founder who is actively putting these ideas into practice. And more importantly, the broad theme of Mr. Andrew's talk today, which is, which invites us to move beyond seeing workplaces as merely places of productivity to places that can actually promote growth and that can actively shape meaning. So with that, I invite Mr. Andrew to deliver his keynote address. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Shilpa. Thank you, Shabdapriti. Thank you, Kamlesh, Nikita, and the entire team at the National Positive Psychology Association in India. It is such a pleasure to be able to be here and to be with your community today. As Shabdapriti described, I wear several different hats in my life beyond being the executive director of the International Positive Psychology Association. I would describe myself, I guess, as a little bit of a pracademic. I care deeply about how the science of well-being gets applied in practice in all sorts of contexts. I am not a psychologist. I have a master's degree in applied positive psychology, but my academic background is actually in anthropology and critical theory. And perhaps most important for this conversation, I've spent probably the last 25 years just deeply immersed in the world of work, and specifically trying to help people who try to do good work figure out how on earth to do that without destroying themselves in the process. And I've spent that time in all sorts of different kinds of organizations. I've worked in giant corporations, leading work in leadership development and talent development. And as a consultant, I've worked with organizations of all shapes and sizes, tiny startups to giant corporations and everything in between. And along the way of that, I've really developed this passion and perhaps an obsessive passion, I'll say, for Aristotle and for Aristotle's ancient wisdom around eudaimonia. And specifically the ways that positive psychology and philosophy and business ethics and the social sciences broadly choose to study this idea of eudaimonia. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today. And chances are this community, the NPPA, is one of the very few communities that I speak to that have even ever heard the term eudaimonia. But normally when I say that I run a company that's called Eudaimonic by design, most people just nod politely and have no clue what on earth I mean. So I'm going to start at the basics. And even if you know this idea, I'm going to encourage you to embrace a beginner's mind and to think about it perhaps for the very first time. Eudaimonia is an ancient Greek word. It is one of the words that's often used to describe well-being. If I were to greatly oversimplify it, it's all about just trying to do good in the world, and that is the source of what well-being actually is. It's often countered with the idea of hedonia, or the idea that well-being is anchored in feeling good or a sense of pleasure. And both feeling good and doing good are probably very essential for our well-being. But when it comes to ethics, which is something that I care really deeply about, especially in the world of work and especially in the world in which we live in, I think that eudaimonia is a really critically important thing to try to understand. Aristotle's most significant writings on eudaimonia were all written in the context of his work on ethics. But he actually also wrote about it in his work on politics, where he argued that the purpose of a city-state, what he would call the polis, is the eudaimonia of its people. For the sake of this keynote, I'm going to suggest that most modern workplaces, at least those that I've known in my lifetime, have the potential to think of themselves a little bit like the way that Aristotle thinks about the idea of a polis. In other words, rather than just trying to satisfy their shareholders' pocketbook, part of an organization's purpose should actually be the eudaimonia of its stakeholders, and perhaps most importantly, the eudaimonia of its employees. Now, to be blunt, most of the corporations that I've encountered in my life have no interest in doing this. All they're interested in is maximizing their quarterly stock price at whatever it actually takes to do that. But I can also say from the decades of experience that I have in working with organizations all around the world, big and small, that there are definitely some, and especially there are many people who work in them who want to do business in different ways. And it's those organizations that I'm particularly interested in working with and in helping, because in reality, the research and the practice around this says that it is really hard to create the conditions of eudaimonia at work. And there's often very little guidance around how to do it. So it's my hope from this talk to be able to explore from an interdisciplinary perspective how, if a company or an organizational consultant or a researcher who's studying any of these things wanted to actually help an organization go on a eudaimonic journey, they could help that organization build the right kind of boat to take them there. Yes, this talk is going to lean very, very heavily on a metaphor of the boat. And I'm using it because I think it's actually a very helpful metaphor to explain all the many complexities that are needed to be in place if people have a fighting chance of designing a eudaimonic organization. Before we get to that, I want to ground ourselves a little bit more in the philosophy of eudaimonia. I also want to talk about what the research across disciplines might suggest is the business case for eudaimonia. And after I get through the boat, I want to share some perspectives of why I think eudaimonia is even more relevant right now in the context of artificial intelligence and the future of work. It's a lot to get through, but before I do, I just want to acknowledge that this keynote builds on an incredible collaboration that I've been able to have with Dr. Carol Riff, who, in my view, is truly the mother of positive psychology and well-being science more broadly. And she and I have been able to work on a couple texts over the last few years on the what, why, and how of eudaimonia at work. So this conversation is very much grounded in the latest thing that we have written together, which is part of a forthcoming chapter that is edited by somebody else you've heard today, Stuart Donaldson, in a handbook on research around organizational positive psychology that is about to be coming out. There are other texts that Carol and I have written that are also very related to the things that I'm talking about today. So feel free to check that out. References are on the screen. I'm also happy to share advanced copies of the chapter if you want, and promise not to tell anybody that I've sent them to you. So you can just reach out to me and ask. All of the things that I'm going to be talking about today are accompanied by hundreds of references. So those references won't all be on the slides, but I can certainly share them with you. Okay, let's dig in to part one of this talk, which is all about the communal soul of eudaimonia and why I think that flourishing is much more about a sense of we than it is about a sense of me. So going back to this word eudaimonia, I think it's helpful just to look at the etymology of the word. In ancient Greek, eu means good, and daimon means soul or demon or God. In other words, eudaimonia is this idea that we all have a soul that yearns to do good. Aristotle's technical definition of eudaimonia is activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. In other words, he would have defined it as the meaning of life being that our goal is to try to figure out what our daimon, our soul, is here to do, and then to try to figure out how do we spend the rest of our time trying to bring the very best of ourselves to make that daimon potentiate. Eudaimonia isn't something you feel, it isn't something you think, it really is the daily practice of trying to do good intentionally and wisely. Eudaimonia is a journey. It's definitely not a destination. And because it is so hard to do good in the world, it's probably going to be a journey that is not going to be easy or fun all the time. It's probably not going to give you all that much pleasure. It's probably going to include a lot of struggle, a lot of failure, a lot of suffering, and perhaps most importantly, some ethical discernment that's going to be required along the way. For Aristotle, eudaimonia wasn't just something that you do on your own. It was really the purpose of a well-functioning society. Part of doing good in the world means that you're trying to create the conditions where other people can be their most eudaimonic selves, where other people can bring the best of themselves to do good in the world. It becomes a virtuous cycle where the individuals flourishes if society flourishes, and society flourishes if more individuals flourish, and that just keeps going. This is a good place to note that Aristotle's version of who should be included in that flourishing society didn't include women, it didn't include slaves, it didn't include children. And while that was obviously very historically rooted in ancient Athens, it's also deeply problematic and it shouldn't be ignored. And I'm glad that we don't live in ancient Athens. And I think we can still hold this beautiful idea alongside of its problems and complexities. As Aristotle would have said, virtue always exists between vices, and our job is to find the golden mean in between. And that's where I certainly hope to try to aim this talk today. Much of modern psychological science, if we go back to this idea of the me and the we, especially positive psychology as a discipline, has really chosen to sidestep this communal part of eudaimonia. And I'll anchor that especially in the Western versions of positive psychology that I have grown up in. That version of psychology is very uncomfortable with making normative claims. It gets very messy to try to say, this is what people ought to be doing. This is what it means. This is what it ought to mean to live a good life, because that's an ethical or a moral question. And psychology is uncomfortable about answering those questions because there isn't a singular answer to those questions. It's much easier to measure well-being in subjective terms. Are you happy? Are you satisfied with your life? This is where most measures of well-being at the population level stop. The problem is that all those subjective ideals of happiness and life satisfaction are often very rooted in assumptions about what makes for a good life that are rooted in very culturally specific norms. And as scholars like Mohsen Joshinlu have argued, most widely used measures of well-being, like subjective well-being, even Carol Riff's psychological well-being, Martin Seligman's PERMA, or other scales of flourishing that are all that many of you have probably used, most of those are very anchored in a very individualistic perspective. They're all about me. These scales suggest that happiness or well-being are grounded in personal autonomy, in self-expression. These are values that very much emerged out of a European Enlightenment. And they're very much a celebration of Western and individualistic and capitalistic worldviews. But they're definitely not the only ways we could be thinking about well-being. If we looked at indigenous or Eastern models of well-being, if we looked at where I'm based in Canada, the medicine wheel, an indigenous perspective of well-being, or Ubuntu in Africa, or Maori well-being, or Confucianism's Ren, or Buddhism's Eight Limbs, or Ayurvedic or yogic models of well-being, we would see so many different connections about what it means to live well and to do good that are far more relational, far more collective, far more ecological. And to date, the majority of well-being science that gets published has shown very little interest in these traditions. Though in no small part due to what I think is the really great work of the NPPA and similar organizations around the world, I do think that that is starting to change. Nonetheless, in practice, what this means is that when most people talk about well-being in most scientific journals, and especially when they're trying to sell well-being through the wellness industry, we often find ourselves in this world that's all about self-optimization. The goal of well-being seems to be becoming my best self, not necessarily contributing to the best world. It's mostly about me. It's almost never about we. And hey, there's definitely value in this approach in today's market-driven world. The wellness industry has exploded into a many billion-dollar marketplace that's focused on self-help and self-care, self-actualization. You go to any airport bookshelf and you'll see books lining the shelves that promise to help you live your best life. Usually they do that through individual habits, through changing your mindset, through productivity hacks. But very few of those books ask deeper moral questions, and even fewer of them would dare to talk about something like ethics. And I think because of all of that, the communal soul of eudaimonia that was so core to the way that Aristotle thought about this idea has been quietly erased. We've lost sight of the ways in which flourishing is a fundamentally relational and ethical project, not just a psychological one. We don't become eudaimonic in isolation. We become eudaimonic through, with, and for others. Okay, that's part one. Now part two. Now that we've got up on some of the fundamentals of eudaimonia, I want to shift into talking about how this fits into the modern workplace. And I'll acknowledge the fact that the workplaces that I know are largely in North American contexts, and so that's going to be the vantage point in which I talk about these. And nonetheless, I think it's pretty applicable across a global perspective. And as a seasoned management consultant who spent the last couple decades trying to work in those organizations, I know better than to try to convince anyone that they should start thinking about something like eudaimonia unless A, they can pronounce it, and B, there's an actual business case for doing so. Unfortunately, there really is a business case for why we should care about these things. A lot of that research that's being done right now is very dedicated to proving that fostering eudaimonic well-being leads to measurable outcomes, especially productivity and performance. For example, the really great work that Jan-Emmanuel Deneuve and George Ward at Oxford and MIT have done with Indeed show that longitudinally there are real strong economic drivers between between well-being as defined in the way that they choose to define it, and increases in task performance, creativity, innovation, engagement, loyalty, innovation, and they outperform the stock market in extraordinary ways. But that's not all. There's decades of longitudinal health science research. Carol Riff has been a dominant person in that space. They clearly show powerful links between eudaimonic well-being and physical health and economic and even longevity. The reality is that the economic value there is that people who have higher eudaimonic well-being, they're less likely to miss work, they'll incur lower long-term healthcare costs. And so many organizations save money when individuals are eudaimonic. The fact is that organizations that invest in eudaimonia are more likely to attract and retain top talent. And that talent tends to be more inspired and more committed. So, yes, eudaimonia is good for business. But also, based on everything that I just said earlier, it feels very un-eudaimonic to argue for human flourishing in solely economic terms. And that kind of materialistic logic that dignity and well-being matter only if they help boost performance is the same logic that built what Alistair McIntyre would call the morally hollow iron cage of organizational life. It's the logic that reduces people to means rather than ends. And it's the reason why so many workplaces feel so soulless and so extractive and morally adrift. If we want to embrace the virtuous core of eudaimonia, we need to reframe it not just as a strategic lever, but as an inherently moral act. We have to pursue it not just because it improves performance, but because it's the right thing to do. And that requires a moral realignment of the business case itself. We need to reintegrate virtue ethics, moral inquiry, and human development into the way that we think about organizations, not as an alternative to productivity and efficiency, but as a necessary counterbalance to those things, not just to prevent harm, but also to actively promote flourishing. Beyond any arguments that might appeal to the optimists amongst us, it's also really imperative to point out that the costs of neglecting well-being are staggering. I mean, around the world, there's skyrocketing mental illness, burnout, rising healthcare costs, and unnecessarily early mortality, especially for literally the 1 in 3 of the global population of workers who don't earn a living wage. These are not just economic challenges, they're moral challenges. If organizations operate without a moral lens, they risk becoming systems that quietly perpetrate those harms to their people, to the planet, and to the very soul of society itself. So we've covered what eudaimonia is and why we should care about it at work. Now, the big question is, how on earth do we make it happen? And I'll just say most of the organizations I've worked with in my career don't feel very much like they're set up to help me unleash my inner daimon so that I can bring the best of myself to do good work. And so trying to wrestle with this fact is really what got me into applied positive psychology in the first place. And I assumed when I took my MAP degree 13, 14 years ago that there'd be lots of really good research and practice to be able to help me figure out how to do this. But most of that research is very focused on interventions designed to boost well-being at the individual level. And in retrospect, that's no surprise for all the same reasons that psychologists tend to sidestep the communal side of well-being. Uh, they also avoid the broader systems and structures that need to be in place for someone to be in place for someone to have the bandwidth to actually focus on those interventions. And lucky for us, psychology isn't the only field asking those questions. If we broaden the search, if we take a more interdisciplinary approach, there's actually plenty of really good social science research that examines various pieces of the puzzle. And the more that you get into that research, the more that you realize how complicated a story eudaimonia at work really is. There are so many moving parts to the systems and the structures at work, and well-being in and itself is complicated. And when you bring collectives of diverse people together into that mix, complicated turns into complex really, really fast. So the bottom line, if you're looking for if you're looking for simple answers, if you're looking for silver bullets, you're going to be very disappointed. But if you like boats, let me give you a little bit of a ride. A boat. Um, Actually, let me just say before I do so that this metaphor of the boat is something that I want to give some credit to Scott Barry Kaufman for. Uh, Scott has spent quite a bit of time rereading Maslow in his theory of self-actualization. And it turns out that Maslow wasn't actually interested in a pyramid as we normally think about the hierarchy of needs. That was mostly management consultants who came up with that one. Kaufman says that Maslow's vision was more like a sailboat, where at the core you have a hull and you have sails, and the hull represents our safety and security needs that keep us dry and safe, and the sails are all the relational growth, self-actualization needs, and those are the things that actually power us along the journey. And it's, pretty hard to focus on those sails if your hull is taking on water. You're just not going to get anywhere. And you need both of those things working together if you actually want to go somewhere. I love this metaphor. I happen to grow up on sailboats, and so I get it. But when I took the metaphor and tried to apply it to the workplace, I found that just focusing on hull and sails weren't enough, and that we needed to think about more of the boat, including those who are on it, how they work together, what the structures of that boat actually are, and where they think that they're going. I also want to give credit to the artist Paige Boivin, who is a Canadian Métis artist I commissioned to help me bring this particular eudaimonic ship to life. Okay, so let's get into it. There's many different components of this boat. I'm going to start with the waters that it sails on. A boat lives in the water, and different boats require very different waters require very different kind of boats. If you're sailing on a breezy summer day, on a little lake, you might be fine with a little dinghy. And if you're trying to cross an ocean in the middle of a stormy winter, you need a very different kind of craft. And the same is true for how organizations should be designed for eudaimonia. We need to understand the industry, the size of the organization, the context in which it's operating before we can truly understand what it means to try and do good or experience well-being while you're doing it. The worlds of the people on the ship matter a lot too. There's a huge amount of longitudinal research that tells us that there are very clear social and economic determinants of well-being. And if we ignore those, we risk gaslighting everyone on board. All of those background variables, as we usually refer them in the psychological literature, are actually the real starting points of our eudaimonic boat, because those waters are what the boat needs to withstand. And they're so radically different that it's almost foolish to think that we'd only need one kind of boat design for any situation. So if we don't factor in those variables in from the very beginning, good luck trying to get to the destination in one piece. One thing I want to flag about the waters of my research, most of it has been done in very weird places, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic countries like the US, Canada, Australia. So the boat I'll describe in this section of my talk has been made for those waters. And I think that we just need much more research on different kinds of boats sailing in very different waters around the globe. The hull. Speaking of staying afloat in boats, let's talk about the structures that actually keep us above the water and not struggling to stay alive. The hull is what keeps us safe and dry. And in an organizational context, the hull is what the International Labor Association which is a part of the United Nations, would call decent work. And for over a century, even before the United Nations started, the ILO has been trying to study what people need from work, not just to survive, but to truly live with dignity. And at its core, decent work includes things like fair and reliable income, job security, safe and healthy working conditions, and being treated with dignity and respect. So let's start with income. Across the world, many people are working, but not earning enough for a decent standard of living. Some estimates would suggest that a significant amount of the global workforce, often cited as around 1 in 3 workers in the world, 1 in 3, don't earn a living wage. And that means even when people are employed, work doesn't actually provide enough of a foundation for a stable life. Beyond income, there's also the question of security. Will I have a job tomorrow? Will my income still be there next month? And for many workers, whether they're in informal roles or contract work, or even in professional roles that are facing automation, this uncertainty is very real. Decent work is also all about safe and healthy conditions. If you're worried about your physical safety or whether you're in a psychologically safe space where you can speak up, then conversations about engagement or well-being can feel really out of reach. And finally, there's the notion of dignity. The ILO speaks about work as a source of human dignity. But for many people, that's not remotely guaranteed. Work still feels like being treated like a resource rather than a human being that should be valued. So, at a minimum, decent work is about freedom from harm, but ultimately, it's also about something so much more. It's about the conditions that allow people not just to survive work, but to be able to bring their full humanity to it. And that takes us to the sales. A sound hall might keep you dry, but it's not going to actually get you anywhere. For that, you need sales that can capture the winds of eudaimonia that might power our journey. And for the sake of my collaboration with Carol Riff, I'm using the sales of psychological well-being. And it's really important when you have sales that you can raise and lower them depending on the conditions in which you're sailing. And so, uh, uh, back. And so we need to be able to access a whole bunch of different things when we are thinking about our sales. Many who know about eudaimonia think that eudaimonia is mostly about a sense of meaning and purpose. And well, maybe that's the mainsail of the boat of eudaimonia. It's definitely not the only one. We need to be able to access all of the dimensions of psychological well-being for us to be able to truly harness the power of the wind. We need sales for autonomy, for positive relationships, for environmental mastery, for self-awareness, and for growth. And those are just Carol's sales. There are so many others that we could be thinking about. And then we need to take into account individual differences in cultural context. We can think about a wide variety of sales that might be useful and all sorts of different kinds of fabrics that those sales might be able to be made of. When we bring our full identities to work, our sales truly can fill with the power of the wind in ways that can actually really take us somewhere. But those sails need to be attached to something. And in a sailboat, the sails are attached to the mast. And at work, that's the structures that support our well-being, the very jobs that we're hired for, the teams that we're a part of. If we design good jobs from the hull up, ones that factor in decency and dignity and freedom, we'll have a much easier time of being able to harness the winds in our sails. And there's a huge amount of organizational design literature that explores how do you do this well. The job characteristics model, for example, shows how we need to design variety and meaning and relationality into our work. It helps us make sure that we have the right kind of feedback mechanisms in place for growth and, of course, correction. Or the job demands resource model is another framework that can be really helpful in helping us figure out the right balance between things that are going to drain our batteries and things that charge them. In general, when we design jobs in a very human-centered way and create structures where individuals can apply their unique strengths, their values, their expectations at work, our maths will ensure that when our sails catch the wind, our boats truly soar. Now that we have the structures of our boat in place, we need to turn to our attention to the actual people who sail it. And research would suggest that the most important place to start there is the captain, the leader, the one who provides the direction, makes sure that the crew is actually working together. And eudaimonic leaders have certain capabilities that help their crews be their best selves at work. And that starts with good role modeling. The eudaimonic leader lives her most significant values, and she talks about them. She makes it clear that what she makes it clear what she aspires to and how that informs her decision making. And she tries to be as transparent as she can be and probably fails forward along the way. The eudaimonic leader demonstrates care. She sees the human beings that surround her. She invests time and resources into building the systems and structures that we've been talking about because of the fact that she cares. The eudaimonic leader also creates cultures of psychological safety where people can really speak up. And if you want a crew to be empowered, they need to have the freedom to have their say, even if they don't always get their way. Finally, our eudaimonic leader doesn't just nap while the crew's at work. She's present. She's supportive. She would do what the self-determination theory folks would describe as autonomy support. She coaches in ways that help people be their very best selves and get things done. Now, the captain's not the only person on this ship unless it's a solo journey. The captain's got a crew. And so the crew needs to work together. And that means that we need to have the right kind of organizational habits and practices and rituals that ultimately create a shared culture. People need to have voice and choice to behave in eudaimonic ways. And that requires a very specific kind of social contract. The crew also needs to be able to participate in decision-making forums in ways that make them feel heard, even if they don't always get what they want. We know that things like learning and growth are really key elements of eudaimonia, so that means our crew's social contract needs to include an imperative to lean in and try new things, even if the results include a little bit of failure along the way. The crew needs rituals of recognition, opportunities where people can truly shine a spotlight on each other and celebrate behaviors that lead to eudaimonia. At the same time, the crew needs to have the confidence that there will be consequences and justice when members of that crew decide to act in ways that get in the way of collective well-being. If eudaimonia is a priority, it means that the crew agrees to honor the humans on board collectively, caring about their whole lives, including what happens off the boat. This social contract of the crew is the daily practice of ethics. Without it, the communal soul of eudaimonia is completely impossible. Now, last but not least, all of those people on the boat need a destination, a North Star where they're aiming for. For the organization, the compass is its shared purpose. It allows everyone on board to make effective decisions about where they're headed, what the right tacks they need to take along the way. The organization's success inevitably has to be part of that shared purpose. If an organization can't sustain itself now or in the future, it won't be able to maintain all of these complex structures and systems of a well-functioning boat. So the boat needs to sail and it needs to sail well. But as I said above, profitability alone isn't enough for eudaimonic ambitions. If we want to harness the moral power of a community that is working hard and enduring the storms, it needs a shared purpose that's greater than putting money in the pockets of shareholders. This is why shared purposes that revolve around the greater good of human beings or the planet are so useful. It doesn't mean that profit isn't important. It's just that the profit should allow the organizations and those who work there the opportunity to really do something quite eudaimonic with it. Okay, I know this boat is complex. I'm exhausted even just trying to describe it, but so is eudaimonia. That's the point. In my experience, people want simple answers and silver bullets, and this is definitely neither of those things. But the boat of eudaimonia really does all need to be there, working in harmony and working with each other. And that requires thinking about it like a system. When one part of the ship inevitably fails, prudence and prioritization and collaboration is required to keep things moving forward. And that really does require commitment from those who are in positions of power and authority. An organization rooted in eudaimonic potential of its people isn't something that's going to be achieved fast. It won't always feel like success in the moment, but in the long term, both the destination and the journey will be worth it. After all, creating the conditions for eudaimonia in others is one of the most eudaimonic things that we can possibly do. And if you are curious about what on earth that means, just think of what it means to be a parent or a mentor or a sibling to someone whose potential you see. Helping someone become who they are meant to be isn't a linear path, and it certainly isn't always easy or fun. But when that person starts to stand in their unique brilliance, when you see them contributing to something extraordinary, and you know that you've played even a tiny part in making that happen, it really is one of the most fulfilling things that any of us can experience. Okay, now that I've covered the what, the why, and the how of eudaimonia at work, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what might get in the way before I open this up to Q&A. So, as you know, when I'm not studying eudaimonia and trying to figure out how to help organizations do something about it, I'm the executive director of IPPA, and we just wrapped up a giant virtual summit on AI and the future of well-being. If you're interested, you can check it out. It's still available on demand at aisummit.ipanetwork.org. Um, but but based on all of that experience and sitting through over 40 different people talking about what AI's implications on the future of well-being is, I took away the, the perhaps totally obvious revelation that AI may help us build better boats. It certainly has the potential to help us understand the waters, to construct sounder hulls, to use our sails more deliberately, to coach our leaders better, to provide resources to our crews. Maybe it might even help us focus on that true North Star with more precision than any compass we've ever had access to so far might. And I also think that there's a very good chance that AI might make most of the crew who sails on those ships have to walk the plank. Undoubtedly, it is going to be a very mixed bag. If history is any kind of a teacher, it will probably just reinforce the existing inequities that we're already experiencing. What that means is that for those who possess means and power and wisdom and money, AI is probably going to be like a bionic arm. And for those who don't have those things, AI might be an anchor that drags us down to the bottom of the ocean. And based on what I'm seeing, I think that the early impact of AI is already very much on the quality of jobs. As the anthropologist David Graeber pointed out in what I think is a brilliant book called On Bullshit Jobs, ever since the Industrial Revolution began, we've been promised that technology is going to increase productivity and give us more time and money to enjoy life. And that is clearly a false promise. Technology may increase productivity, but it doesn't tend to give us freedom. It usually just results in jobs that have less meaning and feel more like, well, in David Graeber's words, bullshit. AI may be new, but the problem of technology and its impact on work definitely isn't. Beyond the Industrial Revolution, hey, we could look at throughout human history, new technologies have always made people worried that society is going to collapse around them. New technologies frequently force us to rethink what work even means. That was probably true for hunters and farmers, just as it is true for when machines started to replace manual labor. Every new piece of technology changes our relationship to whatever we think of as meaningful work. What scares me most about AI is not that it might replace what we do with our hands, but that it might erode our capacity to actually use our heads. As AI increasingly outperforms humans in almost anything technical, including how we code AI itself, we have to ask, what is actually uniquely human here? And perhaps most importantly for this talk, how will AI impact the eudaimonic dimensions of work, the virtuous activity of the soul? Eudaimonia is always about action and about choice. And so I think that part of that answer actually lies in how each one of us, individually and collectively, decides what we're prepared to hold on to. There is a Talmudic scholar who studies the ancient Torah named Sarah Wolkenfeld, who studies the relationship between ancient Jewish texts and what they can teach us about modern technology. She shares this story of two rabbis who were complaining about the rise of the written word. They were really worried that writing was going to destroy the living soul to soul transmission of oral teachings that were really at the heart of what was the ancient Torah. And they also complained about this while they secretly wrote those teachings down so that more people could have access to the Word of God. The moral of this story: progress always involves trade offs. The rabbis didn't reject writing, but they literally and figuratively bound it. They used this new technology carefully so that what mattered most was kept safe: relationships, interpretation, shared meaning. Sarah tells another story of how there are two kinds of words described in the Talmud for work: avodah, which is labor that's assigned to us, and melacha, which is creative, purposeful, meaningful work. It's said that the Abrahamic God spent 6 days doing melacha when he shaped the worlds, and then he stopped on the seventh day of rest. That is how Jews are commanded to refrain from all work on the seventh day, on Shabbat. But it also helps us think about what kind of work we see ourselves doing the other 6 days. Sarah suggests this could actually be a template for the age of AI. Perhaps we let AI handle the avodah, the copy editing, the data linking, the summarizing, but we guard the melacha, the creative wrestling, the moral discernment, the relational work, the many-voiced conversations through which humans channel something that is larger than themselves. So the question for us is not whether AI will shape us. It's actually, how are we going to choose to protect what we think is sacred? Okay, bringing this all together. I've covered a lot of ground in this talk, but here's what it comes down to. I think that work has always been more than just what we do to survive. I think it shapes who we are. I think it shapes how we relate to one another. And I think it shapes what kind of society we want to live in. And if we take Aristotle seriously, I think we need to design work as if eudaimonia mattered. That means looking beyond the language of self-optimization and performance and productivity. It means refusing to treat people just as units of productivity. It means asking different kinds of questions, ethical questions. What ought work to be? I think it also means recognizing that organizations aren't just economic machines, that they're moral communities. We need to build boats, better boats of eudaimonia at work, boats that have sound hulls, full sails, and high functioning captains and crews. Those boats need a compass. They need to be designed to deal with the realities of the waters they're meant to sail on. And I really don't think that's unrealistic because I know that it's already happening, maybe in the margins. There are leaders in organizations that are trying to do things differently. There are people, probably some of us in this virtual room, that are already telling different stories, experimenting with different structures, reclaiming a sense of shared purpose. I think that AI might help us along that journey. I think it also might help us get in the way. But if we're truly being eudaimonic, that means that each of us need to understand that we have a choice. So, in the spirit of the Talmud, I will end this talk by inviting you to reflect: what eudaimonic work in your life are you prepared to declare as sacred? And what are you going to do to protect it? Thank you so much. I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to Q&A.
Thank you, Mr. Andrew. Thank you so much for such an incredibly rich and such a thought-provoking talk. And I wouldn't just say talk, but a dialogue, because you've left us with so much of food for thought. And one thing that you mentioned at the end, I think that really sums up the essence of eudaimonia at work, which is design as if eudaimonia matters. not just
Mm.
because of the profit or the productivity or the business related outcomes, right? And what also stands out is how you have bridged theory and practice. And in a way, you've invited us to reimagine organizations. So the floor is now open for questions. To all our participants, please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box. And I do see that there is a question that has already been posted by someone. And I think it again boils down to designing as if eudaimonia matters, which you, in any case, already concluded with. But once again, if you would like to share your views about, what you think that in terms of the consumerist and the war-stricken and the unstable world that we live in, organizations and workplaces, they treat humans as resources and not, treat employees as resources and not just humans, right? So would you like to share your views about it with regards to maybe your experience of working with different organizations and how you've um, helped them understand and see the value of employees as humans and not just as resources?
Yeah, so yes, thank you for this question. I mean, I think that this is really at the heart of why I care about this topic so much. And I think that in a context of a war-stricken, consumerist, unstable society and world in which we're living in that feels more unstable and precarious every day, that's the reason why I actually find so much comfort in these ideas of eudaimonia and these and I guess even more so because I don't think it has to be just eudaimonia by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, I really do think that we could look all around the world to all sorts of ancient traditions and see all sorts of different ways in which I think we've been asking these questions for as long as humans have probably been around. And we can draw on some of that sense that this is actually a shared responsibility in a communal project. And to me, those are the very things that I think a neoliberal consumerist world tries to take apart from us. And so, and so I guess it's why I relentlessly hold on to and try to, in many ways, preach these ideas of a more ethical way of doing things, and the fact that there can be a more ethical way of even thinking about these things. Because I don't think that the society that we live in right now is the only way that society can be. And so I think that it's kind of on all of us to, and especially those of us in this field of positive psychology, not to make it preachy, but to make it grounded, which is, I hope, what I've tried to do in this presentation too, is to anchor this in real questions and real data, that this isn't toxic positivity, it isn't positive thinking, that this is actually really important hard work we can all do. So I don't know, that's my attempt to answer the question.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Um, we've also received a note of gratitude from Anupama. And okay, so moving on to the other questions. So I'll just sort of consolidate the questions in the best interest of time.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a very interesting question and a very impactful one as well. Then how do you deal with those organizations that do not resonate with eudaimonia? So how do you
Yeah.
sort of go ahead with having those conversations with such organizations?
I think that look, I don't think that every organization is going to care about eudaimonia, and so honestly, um, I have made the decision in my life that that I'm not going to spend huge amounts of time trying to convince other people. I'm more interested in working with the people who actually do have a set, like they may never use the word eudaimonia, but they get it. They fundamentally understand it. They just have no idea how. And so I'm interested in doing that. There's some research that says that if you want to start a wave, if you want to start a revolution, a wave in stands at a football game, the way you don't need everyone to be involved. You only need about like 23.7% of the population to start a population. I'm good with that. Like 23.7% of the population is fine by my standard. Like if we could get that many organizations to care about this stuff, that would be great. So that's one thing that I would say. The other thing is that that book that I described, Why Workplace Wellbeing Matters by Jan Emmanuel Deneuve and George Ward, is a great book. I mean, that research is really powerful, and it shows that organizations that care about things like well-being outperform stock performance by 11 to 20%. And that's a huge, I mean, it's like 250 million data points, 1,700 companies across every stock market indice that's important in the world. And it's really high quality research. So if I'm just talking to an organization that only cares about money, I might still use that argument. I just might also use that argument to say, hey, the economic value is important, the competitive advantage is important, but ultimately the moral side is important too.
There's another question, and that is regarding, in organizational settings, what individual practices best contribute to sustaining eudaimonia?
Um, the boat is if I were to say like if I were only limited to saying one thing, it would be two things, but it would be voice and choice. Like if you narrow that whole entire boat down to like the shortest thing, I think voice and choice is essential for eudaimonia at work. And of course, there's a lot that goes into creating voice and choice, but participative decision making is really, really like if I don't have the opportunity to contribute in any way, I can't bring my best self. I can't exercise my daemon. If I can't choose, if I don't have any sense of autonomy, I can't do any of the rest of it. So creating mechanisms in an organization where people have voice and choice is, I think, the number one thing that we need to try to do.
So much. And I don't see any further questions, but I do have one question, and I believe we can end with that. So, for organizations that are starting off their journey on, incorporating eudaimonia and eudaimonic practices within, what would you say would be a realistic entry point for an organization that is just starting off on their journey
Hmm.
of being an eudaimonic workplace?
I think that in that context of voice and choice, the most useful thing to start with is conversation. Because I think that we need to make sense of what we mean by these things. I have a friend who her name is Maureen McKenna, and she is an appreciative inquiry facilitator. And she talks about the fact that for common sense words, we need to make sense of them as a commons. So eudaimonia, nobody's going to have a clue about. But even well-being, like if we just have a conversation in a workplace, at a team level, around a leadership table, in any kind of a context about what does well-being at work mean to you? Even happiness, if you want to start there, if that's just the easiest entrance point, what does it mean for you to be happy at work? I mean, the Deneuve and Ward questions, there are four questions. How happy was I at work? How much meaning do I feel in my job? How satisfied am I with my job? And how much stress do I feel at work? Those are four very simple questions that anybody can answer and anybody can take some time to reflect about. And I think it's a fantastic starting point, not for the sake of just measuring. I mean, great to measure it, but even more so to be able to have a conversation about, wow, great. Okay, we're a 6 out of 10 on feeling happy at work. What does that mean to us? How do we make sense of that? Why might that be the case? What would it take for us to get to a 7 out of 10 instead of a 6 out of 10? What's one thing we could try next week that might give us an opportunity to be able to get there? I think in so many ways, that's the relational side that we often miss in workplace interventions is those kinds of communal conversations.
Thank you, Mr. Andrew. Thank you so much for joining us today, for giving us your time, and for such an inspiring and such a motivating talk. And you have honestly left us with a lot to think about. And at the end of the day, I think your keynote also reminds us that the future of work is not just about innovation, efficiency, productivity, and even it's not just about artificial intelligence either. Um, it's about consciously designing organizations that will allow people to grow and to flourish. So, with that, we come to the end of the keynote for today's session. In fact, we come to the end of the sessions for today. So, a lot of thanks to all the participants for joining us, and we hope to see you again tomorrow. So, please do join us tomorrow, and we wish you a good day for the rest of the day, Mr. Andrew, and for the participants for the rest of the evening. All right, everyone. Goodbye, and see you tomorrow. Bye bye.
I wish to express my deepest gratitude to the chair for presiding over this session and to our distinguished speaker for the insightful presentation. The powerful ship metaphor really captured how eudaimonia at workplace is all about the alignment of roles, relationships, and purpose. And it was a good reminder that organizations don't just function, they journey toward meaningful flourishing. And I would also like to thank the audience for their valued presence. Thank you.